There's a few levers that an individual can pull in terms of improving their kind of future, right? One is how much you pay in. The other is how much it grows by. And then the third one is how much you need at the end and when you need to take it. So those are the only four levers that you really need to think about. So pensions aren't that complicated. They're made complicated by the people that run them or talk about them. So often when we're talking to employees, we just focus on those four things because those are the four things that you can control.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Mouthy Money podcast. I am joined by my co-host, as ever, Chris Tuite, Head of Consumer Finance at Communications Consultancy, MRM. Chris, hello, how are you doing?
Morning, Ed. How's it going? You all right?
Yeah, very busy this week. We've got interesting topic today. I think there's some kind of, it's uncovering a little bit about things that people might be missing out on that might be worth a decent amount of money, if that's not unfair to say. We've had a recent announcement from the financial regulator, the Financial Conduct Authority, regarding something called targeted support. Now, targeted support is, we're going to get into it for a short amount of time, but the real thing that we want to discuss today is, are you getting the most out of your workplace benefits? To do that, we are joined by a veritable expert on the topic, Matt Mitten, who is Director of Second Sight, part of the Foster de Novo Group. Matt, hello, welcome to the podcast.
Morning, Ed. Morning, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Absolute pleasure. So this is a bit of a roundabout way of going at it, when we're going to just look at targeted support just as a theme at the start, but we're not going to stick with it too long, because what we really want to get into is this piece about workplace benefits and advice and things that people might be missing out on that their employers offer. Before we really kind of dive into that, though, Matt, just tell us a bit about yourself. Tell us your background. Tell us a bit about Second Sight and kind of where you come from on the topic.
For sure. Thank you. Well, yeah, thanks very much for having me. Good morning, everyone. So as Director of Second Sight, we're part of Foster de Novo Group, which is a national corporate financial advisory group. We have recently won Investors in People in Platinum, so we're very proud of that. So we're very keen to look after our people, which I think is important when we're talking about helping other businesses and the people within those businesses. Specialise in corporate pensions and employee benefits. We've got about 150 employees within Second Sight that kind of under my stewardship, and about 1,200 corporate clients and over 200,000 employees within those businesses. My background, though, is originally I was an IFA back in the sort of late 90s, and I ended up with one corporate client who started off with 4 directors that then grew, and they asked could I then do a corporate pension for their employees, and I ended up sitting down with every employee that joined the business to walk them through the pension scheme. And a lot of those employees were quite young. I was quite young at the time. Excuse me, I was in my 20s. So talking to a lot of people in their 20s and 30s about pensions is not something that a lot of people think is fertile ground, if you like. But I was really surprised. It gave me a really good insight into human behavior and psychology of saving and stuff, even amongst young people. So I'm not a buyer of the fact that young people are not interested in pensions. Personally, I've seen young people interested in pensions ever since I've started working. I think a lot is about how it's presented. It's got to be done in a way that's interesting to them, that's relevant to them. So that's kind of sort of fueled my desire, I guess, to always sort of be interested in the people that sit within the corporate client. So we're not a business that just focuses on solving the corporate problem. Whilst we start there, clearly they're our client, they pay our fees. We're very interested in making sure we can make a difference to the lives of the people that work in those businesses. So we've been working on financial education and financial well-being, across short, medium and long term for many years. But historically, we all started in the pensions world, and that's kind of a lot of our background has been on helping to advise, guide people. And we should probably talk about the difference about that within workplace pension schemes for over 25 years, really.
Advice sounds like a good word to most of our listeners, right? But within the industry, if you cross the line into advice, then you're going into sort of a regulated area where we need to be careful about what we say to consumers and how that's handled. Is that fair to say? It's just
so I think it is fair to say, and I think that if you speak to people in HR, they're terrified of being perceived as giving financial advice, because in order to do that, you have to be qualified, you have to be regulated, and if you don't, it's illegal, and the threat is you could go to prison. So it's a pretty serious sanction. I don't know of anybody who has ever actually been to prison for giving financial advice in the workplace when they weren't regulated to do so. But that's not a call to a call to action. So yeah, so there's a very big fear out there that you'll have a ton of bricks come on you if you cross that line and you're not regulated to do so. Now, I think the difference when you're working in a regulated firm between what's guidance and what's advice is, where do you stop when you're giving advice? Is that, can you give someone advice around one small element of their lives and finances without knowing all the circumstances that surround that individual? So can I give someone advice about how much to save into a pension scheme without knowing how much debt they've got? Can I give someone advice on, what levels of savings they should be making when, I don't know their other assets? So it's really hard just to say, right, okay, someone comes to me and says, I want some advice on one particular area only. Well, my job as an advisor, I suppose if I use the analogy of a doctor, if you come to the doctor, like, I've got a sore throat, and he looks at you and you're covered in sort of, pustules and spots and everything else. And he says, well, hang on a minute, I think we should probably have a talk about, no, I don't want to talk about any of that. I just want to talk about my sore throat, please. You've got to try and, that's the difficulty within an advisory world, is where you stop. And I think the FCA has always been very, very strict about saying, look, you can't advise somebody on one individual thing without knowing that complete circumstances. Otherwise, you're sort of a dereliction of duty, really, as an advisor. So I would welcome the opportunity to find a way through this, by the way, because I think it's great for people to be able to get some more targeted support, targeted advice, whatever. I just worry that what will happen is we will get bogged down in the regulatory environment, and it will get watered down or pared back such that it's very hard to give anything of real meaning and value to somebody in case you end up sort of getting the wrong side of that advice line, which has happened in the past.
So the key here is obviously that they want to make a change. We're not there yet. It's all still quite unclear about, where we're going to end up with it. But now the key thing here is that actually there are quite a lot of people out there who are workers, who are employees of their companies, who may already have access to these kind of services that are worth probably potentially quite a lot of money to them, that they are not accessing. Do you have a sense of how big an issue that is? Because obviously you're helping these companies provide these services, and there's lots of people probably not taking them up, right?
Well, this is one of the biggest frustrations that we have, is that we've got some clients of ours that engage fully with us with all of the services that we provide. And, I think I talk of a kind of a ladder, really, or of kind of engagement activities that you can do. And the very kind of pinnacle of that is the one-to-one advice meeting you could have, paid for by your employer, to sit down with an advisor and talk about your retirement planning within the context of your group pension scheme, which is very similar to this sort of targeted support we're talking about now, or simplified advice. It is possible to create that environment to do that. And we've got quite a large number of employers that will pay for that service for members, and yet people don't take it up. People don't. When they get offered it when they join, they get offered it when they turn 50, they get offered it if there's significant changes to the pension scheme, and yet people don't take it up. Now, I can assure you that's not from the lack of trying, either from the client's communication side or from our side. So there really is still, I think, some psychological blockers to people wanting to do this. Is it always a tomorrow problem, or is it the fact that we've got more of a generation now that are coming to the workforce that are less wanting to engage in person and more want to engage digitally? I mean, on that point, we've just launched something which is a digital advice proposition to try and help people have a plan. So, I think one of the key problems is, when you're talking about pensions, back to my earlier point about advice, is it possible for me to give advice to someone just about a pension when we don't know what their short-term or medium-term objectives are? If they can't afford to live month to month because they're not budgeting properly, you shouldn't really be advising them to pay more into a pension. I could do a quick assessment and say, well, this individual's on target for a much lower income than they need when they stop working. You should pay more in, which I think would fit into this targeted support conversation. But if that person hasn't told me that they're not meeting their, making ends meet each month, then that's not really good advice. So yeah, the digital proposition that we've launched, which we think has got a place in the market, looks at people's short-term, medium-term and long-term, and provides regulated advice in a digital context, which we hope might help connect with a more kind of, I don't want to say just the Gen Zers, but they're people that prefer to interact online rather than in person. But there's a whole load of things that most companies, certainly companies that we deal with, a lot of companies that we know about, will be offering some sort of tailored support to their staff. It's unusual these days to just rely on the pension provider. We should probably get to pension providers in just a second, because I think some of the thing about targeted support is that the FCA expects this to be provided for free, which doesn't really sit with the business models that operate within corporate sort of financial advice and corporate pensions advice. We operate on a fee basis. So if a corporate client of ours isn't going to pay a fee, but they could go to the pension provider and get targeted support for free, then where they're going to lean towards that. The product providers themselves, their business model is about assets under management. That's how they make their money. So they're then out there encouraging people to pay more in. Are we getting to a dangerous conflict of interests here, where I'm working for a product provider where my financial incentive is to get you to pay more in? Is there a danger that I'm incentivized to get people to do that in a way that may not be best for those people? Again, it creates some difficult conversations, I think.
So just for people listening thinking, well, and I don't work for a very big company, I probably don't have access to that kind of thing. What sort of company sizes do you work with? Is it all the full range? I mean, a company with 3 people in it, would they have?
Yeah, I think it's about the
stuff?
culture of the way the business is set up rather than the size of the business. We've got companies of all sizes that have got single digit employee numbers, and they really care about what happens to their people, and they offer incredibly beneficial support to people, financial advice or wide-ranging benefits. I think it's a cultural thing rather than a size thing, and sometimes it's actually easier if you've got fewer employees. I know it's still a per head cost, but it's certainly not easier to talk to 5 people than it is to try and talk to 5,000 people in your business. So if you're trying to communicate or launch something, having only a small number of people to talk to makes it a lot easier.
Is there, for an employee who wants to engage in that process, are there costs associated? Is it covered by the company? How does that
I mean,
work
we
exactly?
would always recommend that the company is paying for this service, because we want to be able to stand up and say, we've got no agenda here other than to help you improve your financial future. That's kind of one of our big mantras, is we want to make a difference to people's financial futures. And, if the only way we can do that is by offering free webinars and then sell them something on the back of it, that doesn't sit well with me, and that's certainly not what we do as a business. So I think if the employer is serious about this, then they should be paying for something, because then it's impartial and it's not trying to then sell something to your employees. And if I was an employee and someone stood in front of me presenting to me and I knew that they weren't getting paid to do it, I would be asking a question. So, what's in it for you if it's not me? Immediately I feel that relationship is slightly askew. Whereas going back to your earlier point, Ed, pensions have changed a lot. So paternalistic final salary defined benefit schemes where people didn't have to worry about anything, to now the defined contribution schemes where everything is on the member. How far can you keep pushing that responsibility to the member? If you're an employer, do you have any sort of moral contract with your employees to look after them from a financial perspective? We talked before about, when I first started work, you would go to work and it was expected you would leave your home life behind. You leave that at the door when you enter the workplace. But nowadays, everybody wants you to bring your best self. Well, to be your best self, to be well, to have good well-being, that must include financial well-being. I've long been talking about the link between people's mental health and financial well-being. It's clearly very obvious link, and yet it's not something that's talked about enough, I don't think. But you as an employer have some sort of duty of care there, in my opinion, to look after your employees. If you're doing it for their mental health and you're doing it for their physical health, and you organise social events, then you should be doing something financially as well. So if you are an employee and your business doesn't do anything, then maybe ask that question, why not? Maybe the employer's not aware of what's available. And, I would suggest that, financial well-being is a conversation that we're having more and more now with businesses about how to sort of implement a financial well-being program for their people.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Matt, actually. If I'm thinking about, a hypothetical company, what sort of employees do I want? I want them as calm and stable and happy as possible. And nothing is more, well, many things are destabilizing. I shouldn't say that. But one of the things that can be most destabilizing is financial insecurity or worries about money, particularly at a time like this where we're facing all sorts of economic uncertainty and all that kind of stuff. And it's a real cause of stress. And stress is a distraction from people bringing their best selves to work, as you were saying. So it is. I think it is in employers' interest to make sure that people feel happy about what they're doing with their money, and that they're getting the best possible guidance that they can. The other thing to say here, Ed and I are on a bit of a journey as part of this podcast, and speaking to experts such as yourself about how do we take our own finances forward, and how do we then bring that to our audience as kind of interesting examples and things they might consider to make their own kind of plan. At no point in that process have I taken any formal financial guidance advice, because frankly, it can be quite expensive. And so in order to kind of do that, if somebody is willing to pay for me to sit down and do that, then that is something I absolutely would consider. And I think everybody listening to this should consider, because it's valuable. Like you say, you used the doctor analogy before. It's like speaking to a specialist consultant about areas that can massively improve your financial health and well-being, to stretch that analogy. I think the idea that this is not being taken up is a concern to me. And I wonder if it's something about the optics of the conversation. One of the things that springs to mind is recently Ed knows this, and some of the listeners know this, I'm looking across my pensions and projecting into the future after some of the guests that we've had, and was having a conversation with my wife to try and convince Tanya, who appears all the time on this in name, to free up the login details so that I could log into her pension and work with her about what good would look like. And that was an ongoing process, because something always got in the way. 2 young kids, stuff happening, I just don't want to think about it. And I know this is probably not a compliant way of doing it, but it was a way that I could sort of sell this conversation to her. Was, right, okay, I'm going to go in, have a guess at what you've got, and project forward based on 6% market growth over 20, 30 years, how much money you could have at age 70 in a pension pot. And all of a sudden, when you start talking about having somewhere north of £500,000 rather than you should look at your pension, I was speaking in terms of you may be able to get up to around sort of £500,000 plus in your pension if you were to do this kind of stuff. That conversation became a lot easier. Again, I understand there are reasons why regulated professionals can't speak in those terms, but it was quite interesting that sort of dangled a carrot of saying, okay, this is something worth doing. There's a tangible benefit at the end of it. So I think that kind of framing helped on a personal level. But I was even caveating it, saying that won't necessarily happen, might not necessarily, depends on markets, depends on all sorts of other things. But because of
all the risk warnings that you'd seen.
Well, even in personal conversations. But I think there's something around that. It's like, pension feels a little bit too opaque or distant or boring, or
it's a negative word. Works. Undoubtedly, it's a negative word. If you did a kind of a workshop and said, put the word up pension, what's the word association? I've done this before in a workshop. They're all generally negative words, complicated, expensive, rip off, all that sort of stuff. So, it is a hard one. I think money generally is something that is not talked about enough at an early age in this country. If we're starting to look at what the problems are, you need to go probably further upstream. And, my kids are a bit older than yours by the sounds of it, Chris. So I've got a 21-year-old and an 18-year-old. I'm pleased to say they've got junior ISAs. My 21-year-old for her 18th birthday got a check from her grandmother and put half of it in a pension.
Wow. It was amazing financial discipline in the Mitten family.
I applaud everyone. I know. I was really impressed, and I wasn't even pushing her to do it. I have to say, she decided it off her own back, partly because.
Were you giving those presentations over family holidays?
Yeah, Matt? Exactly. The poor kids sitting down at family dinners. Right now, let me practice in front of you.
Let's talk compound interest. Anyway, sorry.
So, but I think the point is that my daughter said it to me just the other day. She said, "Look, no one talks to us about money." She said, "I have to come to you for everything." So no one at school tells me about mortgages. No one talks to me about debt. Where's all of that education? And I think as a result of that, there's this big taboo about money. I think the other issue is because everyone is busy, often self-care comes last. So, we're probably all a bit guilty at times of when we're a bit busy. I'll admit at the moment I'm really busy. My exercise regime has slipped. That's one of the things that can go, or your food regime, or okay, I'm not going to have a drink during the week, except on this week I'm really stressed, so I might have a drink on a Thursday. All those things are easy to put yourself last. I think money is the same with that, is that it's a problem that I can deal with later. And it's also the fact is that research shows people are quite scared of looking at money. I think the idea of talking to a financial advisor is quite intimidating. Is the idea of having a mirror held up to your finances something that you're a bit scared of what that might look like? So I think I welcome some of the other language that we're using at the moment around coaching. Financial coaching, I think, is a really good term phrase. all of that sort of stuff that makes it a bit less intimidating, a bit easier for people to access. I think all of that still feels advisory without it necessarily having to be capital A advice, financial advice, regulatory. I was talking earlier about some of the different kind of ladders of communications that we've got. We offer everything from a 20-minute drop-in, which has become really popular. Just have a conversation. They're a qualified financial advisor they're talking to, but it's usually just about one particular element. So I might be busy and say, I just want to check with you. Can I pay into more than one ISA? I've got 20, I know I can put in 20 grand, but can I put that across 2 different ISAs, or something simple where they just need to check something because they're relatively savvy, but they might want to check something. You're not getting into advice there. You're not saying, which fund should I put it in? But it's a quick conversation with a financial expert. I think those are really helpful. You can get access to, you can do a lot of people. You can see a lot of people in a day if there's only 20-minute sessions. So if you're an employer thinking, well, how do I get my pound to go a bit further without paying for regulated advice? Virtual sessions like that are pretty easy to organize. Coaching sessions for 45 minutes about any aspect of your finances. Again, there's no regulated advice going on, but again, it can help people just get this plan together, just to start thinking, where do I start with my finances? How do I create a short-term, a medium-term, and a long-term plan? Because I get your point, Chris. Financial advice is expensive. I think less than 10% of people pay for financial advice every year, and that's also built around a model that most financial advisors probably charge fees based on the assets that you have. And there aren't that many advisors out there. There are a few that will charge an hourly rate, but again, who wants to be on the clock all the time? That feels quite nerve-wracking. Every time I want to speak to my financial advisor, I know he's putting me on the clock. And so, there's a big swathe of the population, what I call the majority in the middle, that will find it hard to get access to good quality financial advice, which is where the workplace comes in, because I do think the workplace can facilitate that financial education, that financial guidance, the targeted support, all that stuff. I think it does fall to the employer. I think it's really hard for someone to say, actually, no, that's not for me. Our employees are here just to work in order to benefit the shareholders. That doesn't feel very modern thinking to me.
I love the idea of a financial advisor holding up my various balance sheets as some kind of Rorschach's test about people feeling a bit uncomfortable. What am I going to see in these numbers?
Yeah.
That tells me about myself. So, yeah, I think you're onto something there. I really do. I think there's something in that.
So, yeah, just the other thing is, what is the persona of a financial advisor? I mean, again, if you went to ask your customer base, I'd be interested to know what they think. They're probably expecting someone male, a bit older, grey hair, probably white, probably middle class. There are a whole range of financial advisors that are not like that, and they need to be brought forward so that it's a much more diverse group of people, to be able to represent all ages and, genders and ethnicity, all of that sort of stuff, so that we're getting away from this sort of white male stale kind of, persona of what a financial advisor is. No one wants to. So, for example, we don't choose those type of people to go and present to young audiences. Otherwise, it feels like someone's dad coming to tell them how to manage their money, which again isn't a great message, So we need the younger people out there as well, talking to younger people in a language they understand.
The more I listen to this, the more I feel like a lot of it just comes down to problems with the branding of it and the way in which we kind of have like your pension is that and a financial advisor is that. And actually, if we just called them financial coaches and lifetime savings instead, people would suddenly start engaging with it. And I love to bring it back to the state pension. I do think the state pension is a big toad that sits over all of this, creating misunderstanding, because people just think, oh, state pension, I'll get that when I retire and I don't need to do anything about it for 30, for over the course of a 40-year career. And then they just transfer that understanding to their private pension. And what happened was we introduced auto-enrollment and defined contribution, these, what you put in, you get out pensions. And nobody followed up with telling employers you have to, force advice on your employees in order to make these products successful.
Yeah, I mean, it's a shocking story. Ed, sorry to interrupt. A shocking story on that point was we were talking to a client, a bunch of employees at a client, and I heard this from one of my colleagues, and this guy came up to the presenter at the end and said, "Look, I think I'm all right." Because I've got the state pension and I only get £12,000 a year. And he held up his statement and he had £12,000 in his pension. And, he said, I'm retiring in 2 years' time. And it's like, crumbs, what do you do in that situation? The lack of understanding there, compared to the reality is scary. I mean, thankfully it doesn't happen all the time. Yeah. But to your point about the state pension, when I first started working, it felt relatively insignificant in someone's planning. You know, we used to often give people the option whether they wanted to include it or not. Would it even be around when you stop working? You know, it now feels like it's a very significant part of most people's retirement planning. You know, £12,000 a year is not to be sniffed at for most people. And I think as a base level to begin your planning from, if you're someone who's on £30,000 salary, £40,000 salary, that's you know, that's your defined benefit scheme. You know, that's your defined benefit underpin, isn't it? That's really valuable. People have no idea about how valuable that is.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, back to your point as well about employers should be doing more around, or the employers were not told that auto enrollment wasn't going to be enough. I think there was so much backslapping about the success of auto enrollment that people forgot to communicate that actually it's not enough and that 8% won't get you what you need.
I think default funds are really interesting in this, Matt. And I'm going to declare an aversion to default funds. I had a bad experience with a default fund in one of my early employer pensions. And I think if you looked at how many people are in them, and maybe they're right for some people, but younger people in these default funds that won't generate the kind of growth that you need, I think, over a long period of time is an indictment of how little that information has been fed through to people and how they think, well, I'll just whack it in here and it'll be fine. And I haven't done the maths, so it may well be. Actually, you need to understand where your money is going. It's a large chunk of free money coming from your employer when it comes to auto enrollment. You're putting in money yourself. That's not an insignificant amount over a long period of time. And you need to make sure you're maximizing the benefits for it. And the amount of people that I know, even in my own personal circles, who are just kind of languishing in a default fund thinking, oh, well, it'll be all right on the night, it annoys me. It upsets me. It's like, well, no, you need to have a think about what that's invested in, how long it's invested for. And then you get into more complicated questions and people do switch off. And that's kind of the complexity around this pensions thing. But we frame it through this lens of, if you want a pot of a certain size, you need X amount of growth. And this is not the way probably not the way you're going to go about getting that. That changes the conversation radically.
Yeah, there's a few levers that an individual can pull in terms of improving their kind of future, right? One is how much you pay in. The other is how much it grows by. And then the third one is how much you need at the end and when you need to take it. So those are the only four levers that you really need to think about. So pensions aren't that complicated. They're made complicated by the people that run them or talk about them. So often when we're talking to employees, we just focus on those four things because those are the four things that you can control. You can't control the charges because that's set somewhere else, and if you are in the default fund, well, then, most people are not confident enough to choose something else. So that's almost outside of your remit of control. So you're really down to how much you pay in and when you decide to take it. So starting to narrow down the number of decisions someone needs to make makes it easier to make a decision, doesn't it? If I've got to decide on 18 things, then that's quite complex and quite overwhelming. If I've only got to decide on 2 things, then I might be able to make those decisions relatively easily. So there's a whole swathe of changes going on in default funds right now. So nearly all of the providers have moved to more risk early on. So it's going to be really interesting because there's a danger they're doing it at the wrong time with the markets being at record highs, right? So all these changes are happening because everyone's saying, oh, you need to be in equities for longer. And actually, I'm a big believer of that too. I think that probably should be the right thing to be done. I think we've been a bit too cautious too early on. The thing that I have a problem with is lifestyling, which is the de-risking element that starts 15 years from your selected retirement age, which is automatically assumed to be, in most companies, 65, some odd reason, even though state pension age is no longer 65. So someone will start de-risking at 50. So I'm 52 now. And that means I would be 2 years into my de-risking lifestyling phase. And I'm thinking that's absolute madness. So I think the whole lifestyling thing needs to be re-looked at. It's interesting seeing 1 or 2 providers, still lifestyling to their selected retirement age. So let's say that is 65. The expectation is at 65, your income, your circumstances are not going to change. And therefore, you're going to want the same investment strategy thereafter. Seems wrong. Quite like 1 or 2 of the providers that have a lifestyling strategy that goes beyond the retirement age, because actually most people will still remain invested, could continue working part-time, could have other options. So yeah, there's a whole big debate around default investments, but they are undergoing huge amounts of change right now, particularly if you now add in private markets, what that does, and the recent Mansion House Accord, what's that going to do to default funds pricing, all that sort of stuff. So that is becoming quite a complicated area. And I'm not quite sure how the consumer is going to understand those changes, or how they're positioned potentially with the consumers. I think that's more complicated. And for those people that don't want to be in a default fund, they've got to be quite brave to be able to go on and say, right, I'm going to choose a different fund. How do they go about doing that? Now, that is complicated, particularly as it's now possible to do it on the app. Most providers will allow you to change funds on the app. So what happens if someone has a chat with someone down the pub who thinks, oh, this guy's made a bit of money, and he says, oh, you should put all your money into, I don't know, Chinese equities, or the next big thing is property in Malaysia, and you find a fund that can do that. There's a real danger people will end up doing the wrong thing. Yeah. So I don't know what the answer is on that one. If I'm honest with you, I think the default funds are the least worst option for most people, but it doesn't make them any good.
So I think the takeaway here is obviously for people who think, okay, well, maybe I do have access to this kind of stuff. So the first thing would be to say, go and check with your employer whether you've got it, right? Whether they're offering it. Now, if they don't offer it, what could somebody do? Can they just lobby to get their HR to get in touch with you?
Yes,
or
lobby to get some, yeah.
What would you recommend?
Well, I think it depends on what stage of life you're at. If you're over 50, you can talk to pension-wise. I think you can get some free sort of guidance there. I think most product providers, most pension providers have a support desk of some kind. They will be giving you all the risk warnings and all the things they can't do before they can tell you anything they can do. So you might find it a little bit painful to begin with. Some providers are better than others, to be fair, but there's some generic help you can probably get from pension providers. There are certain pension providers as well that I think are doing more than just pensions. I feel like I'm on the BBC and can't name anybody for fear of sponsorship or whatever. So
name away, Matt. It's fine.
Yeah,
I mean,
we'll tag it in the
like what
comments.
Standard Life are doing, if I'm honest with you. They have got a really good app. They're online. Their online website's pretty good, but I think their app in particular is good, and they're spreading their message out broader and beyond just the pensions message. So they're talking about something called Money Mindset, which enables you to aggregate your investments and across other platforms onto there, so you can see everything in one place. They've got quite good education material on there. But Standard Life's not the only one. There are others as well, but I just quite like the way their language is the way they present things feels quite digestible. So
they were recent guests on the podcast, so I will assure listeners at this point that this is not a paid name drop by Matt here. It's purely incidental that they were recently actually on the podcast as well. But that's good because they're spreading that.
I mean, if you'd asked me 5 years ago, I wouldn't have touched Standard Life with a barge pole. So things change, right? So these things do tend to come around in cycles. We thought when Standard Life got bought by Phoenix, it would be a disaster, but it turned out actually to be the best thing that ever happened to Standard Life. So providers go through cycles, and I think that with the advent of technology, the providers that are investing the most in that technology will be the ones that come out in front. And, there are one or two out there that are doing some interesting things. We haven't touched on AI. Obviously, that's something that will have an impact at some point as to how we engage. Will that replace advisors? That's probably a good question to have on a podcast at some point, is will AI replace the human element of advice? Now, I think it will be for some time a combination of digital and personal. So I mentioned the digital proposition we had earlier. It's not solely digital. So if someone gets to a point where they need advice and they want to speak to someone, they can do that. So we've kind of done digital first with advisor sat behind. I think others do advisor first with digital sat behind. So there's different ways of doing it, but that's definitely something that will come about. So there is material out there. The problem, to be honest with you, most of the problem isn't the lack of content, it's the lack of motivation for people to go and look for that content. Again, there's two elements we talk about within kind of financial well-being, and a lot of what people focus on is the mechanics, the stuff they're doing, the products, the charges, the features, rather than the other bit, which is probably the most important bit, which is the psychology, which is, I've got a couple of examples if we've got time. So one of them is, we work for a company that they manufacture chips. They're a manufacturing business. They are really generous. They have a really family-orientated business. They offer a 12% pension contribution if you pay in 6. That's 18% if you pay going into your pension. Most of these people are blue-collar workers and work on the factory floor. That will give them a really good pension if they pay in 6 and get 12. Most of them, if you ask them what their biggest concern is about not having enough money in retirement. This isn't because the fact that they're not going to have enough, they're just not made aware of it. So these people are actually financially well, they just don't know it. Okay, so and there are probably a bunch of people in that category, they've just never looked at it. The psychology is the desire to then change your habits and behaviors. A lot of people don't focus on what that is, they focus on the stuff. And that includes the product providers, which is why I think we've got poor engagement on pensions. People don't focus on the things that motivate people. Pleasure and pain are big motivators, and that tends not to be part of the language that is used to get people to take action. We talk about, there's one of our communication tools that we use is what we call a retire workshop. So retire stands as an acronym for something. And the idea is we tried to take our learning from a one-to-one meeting and then put that into a group environment to lower the cost of access to, detailed kind of help. And for us, the number one thing that will change someone's future is how much they pay in. We can talk about the funds, we can talk about the charges all day long, but someone pays an extra 1 or 2% a year and then increases that, every couple of years to get to maybe, a 15% pension contribution. They'll have a really healthy retirement. Now, trying to get someone to pay that in on day one is really hard. But if you sit down with someone and you sort of get them to have done a bit of pre-work, which says, tell me what your outgoings are now. What do you think those outgoings will be when you stop working? We can probably deduct some of those things that you're paying for now. Hopefully you won't have a mortgage. If your children are grown up, then you won't pay less for them and so on. So you get to a point, now, even if they don't know what it is, it just needs to be as clear as it possibly can be. You can go through your bills, you can put that in today's terms. We know as a minimum, you need that as an absolute minimum in order to have a minimum quality of life. Now, if we say, okay, well, how much extra would you like to have if there was a bit extra to spend because you want to go? So let's talk about some of the nice things you want to do on holidays. And, so let's build up where you'd like it to be as an optimum. So you've then got a range here. And then if we can show them what they've got built up so far, including the state pension, where that comes in, if that is below their minimum line, at this point, they're having an emotional moment where they will take some action because they've said that's their minimum. That's the absolute minimum they need to live on. So if you can make that detailed enough and you make that forecast accurate enough, in that particular moment, in our experience, that is the emotional point at which someone then makes a decision. They're not talking about what the charges are at that point or the fund performance. This is really about the lifestyle they've got. This is a personal connection. That is the thing that makes the difference between someone making a decision to do something or not, in our opinion. But it's really hard to do that through a website. It's really hard to do that, through the written word. You've really got to find a way to do it. Historically it was one-to-one. Now we're trying to do it in smaller groups to get that same emotional connection. But to be honest with you, that is the thing that really makes a difference. And, we don't see enough of that. That's the psychology behind the financial well-being, if you like. That's the psychology that needs to be brought into some of the training materials that are out there.
Yeah, I think this is ultimately something that we kind of reflect on a lot here on the podcast, actually, is that while it is in a sense about the money, it's about choices and, the freedom that the money gives to you. It's not about being Scrooge McDuck with the silo full of gold coins kind of thing that you just, you sit on every day for the rest of your life. It's about giving yourself those choices you want to have in retirement and the luxury of choice, effectively. And then at this stage, making that plan to get to that point and having that plan, right?
I think I was listening to one of your other podcasts with a financial planner and just listening to her sort of saying money's part of the overall well-being story, and I think this is true that around a lot of the financial planners that work within Foster De Novo is that, money makes up one element of what they're planning and advising on. They're trying to create a vision and a lifestyle and that makes them feel happy. People want, if you've got goals and ambitions and you can see things that in the future that motivate you, you're far more motivated to do something. That's the pleasure bit I was talking about. The pain bit is when you show them they haven't got enough at the moment. But factoring all of that into someone's overall planning it's the well-being conversation. And that applies to anybody and everybody, irrespective of what you earn. So financial well-being isn't about earning more money. It's about being in control of the money that you have and understanding what that will get you and therefore learning to live within that expectation and having that education so that you can get there and go, okay, I'm now on track for something that makes me feel happy, makes me feel comfortable. Back to your earlier point, Chris, that removes the stress from my life. I don't have this stuff buzzing around my head. Am I going to be okay this month? Am I going to be okay next year? Am I going to be okay in 20 years? Those are the questions that we want to try and answer. And I think the workplace is a great place to be able to do that. Even just having that conversation to get someone to think like that is slightly different to, we've got a pensions advisor coming in to talk to you about the pension scheme. Well, that's not really going to get that many people excited. If you say we've got someone to come and talk to you about your well-being and your financial well-being and help you to create a plan, that is, I think, a bit more interesting than just have someone come and talk to you about the pension scheme. Because then you're back to the mechanics. What they do is they come in, They'll talk to you about the fund performance of the last 12 months, tell you about the charges, they'll tell you about the product provider and the name and how long they've been around, all that sort of stuff, which no one's really particular. And then you've lost your audience then. So, you need to get people, I think, talking more about within a context of their broader lives rather than in isolation.
Brilliant. Well, I think that wraps it up perfectly, in fact. Hopefully this inspires some people to go and start bugging their employers, I guess, for the benefit and that kind of thing. And Chris, I know I'm going to be going to our HR representative and asking very careful questions very shortly. Because I have actually never received advice either myself, except for one time when I got some free bad advice. But I won't go into that today. But on that note, Matt, it's been an absolute pleasure. Really, really interesting insights into, obviously, really important area. So thank you.
It's a pleasure, Ed. Thank you very much. Chris, really nice to meet you both. Good luck with your mission.
Thank you.
And Chris, thanks as ever.
My pleasure.
And thank you, everybody, for tuning in. We will see you next time. With that, thank you very much and goodbye.
Thanks, guys. Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning into the Mouthy Money podcast. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe on all our content. Follow us for more on your preferred podcasting channel, including Spotify, YouTube, or Apple Podcasts. Stay in touch by following our social channels on Instagram, TikTok, and LinkedIn. And don't forget to subscribe to the Mouthy Money newsletter on mouthymoney.co.uk. The Mouthy Money podcast is produced for general informational purposes only. It should not be construed as investment, legal, tax, or other forms of financial advice. If in any doubt about the themes expressed, consider consulting with a regulated financial professional for your own personal situation. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. Investments can go down as well as up, and you may get back less than you started with. Never invest more than you can afford to lose. For more information, visit fca.org.uk/investsmart for more. Thank you.